Okay, so this is Adam Smith. I guess we could start with his. Before I made this lecture, I was just looking at his grave site. So this is his grave marker, which says, "Here are deposited the remains of Adam Smith, author of Theories of Moral Sentiments and Wealth of Nations, born on my birthday, June the 5th, 1723, died July 17th, 1790." Okay, well, that's a little of a gruesome way to start a lecture, but so for each kind of formal chapter here, I'm going to spend some time just talking about the person. And so at this point, we'll just kind of have this picture, and you'll kind of be listening to what I'm saying. And then when we get to talking more about the theory and whatnot, that would be then when I start going through the slides. Okay. Let me just make this so that we can just see this easier here. Okay, so the idea of when we get, Adam Smith as a person, even when he was alive, he was not a forgotten person. He was a pretty well-known person, certainly by the 1760s, which was obviously about 30 years before his death. Now, he was a bit of a unique individual as a person. Professors do get this characterization that we're absent-minded. Well, he was among the most absent-minded that, there's all these like crazy stories of like him, like, falling into big pits or, making weird things in the kitchen and thinking it was something else. And he's just a odd person, I guess is the best way to say it. And yet, despite all those things, he started as a professor in Scotland. Oh, I should have said that too. He is notorious as a person that he was once kidnapped by gypsies when he was a little kid. And his dad had died, but his uncle had to like chase down the gypsies and get him back or something. That's kind of a famous story about Adam Smith and gypsies. But outside of those kinds of just Adam Smith, the person kind of points here, Adam Smith focused on just a general field, not of economics, but of a field called moral philosophy. And what moral philosophy did as a field is it was looking for order and harmony in the world. So moral philosophy would look at things like ethics, theology, the law, politics, and if we think about what economics does, is it does give some order to a market. So moral philosophy, natural theology, kind of as a synonym term, was a way to understand the idea that, England in the latter part of the 18th century was a society where, it was pretty cruel, right? I mean, you can read literature from that time, right, which would be from like Charles Dickens and whatnot. And, right, you basically have a pretty cruel, pretty, difficult society to live in. A society where people that were rich were, very, very rich, and that people who were poor were quite poor. Sorry, I was just making sure that it was still recording. And so what we do with all that, right, is we'd want to understand why is the society set up this way? What is it about the society that makes it still able to operate? Despite this kind of very stark, these very stark differences. He, as a person who, again, became a professor actually quite young. He was only 28 years old. Um, I guess I was 28 when I started my job, but he was already the chair of logic at the University of Glasgow. I was just an assistant professor. This guy's the chair, so he's the boss of all bosses. But when he starts as a chair of logic and then later a chair of moral philosophy, he's operating in the time of the Scottish Enlightenment. That would mean that he's reading things like David Hume, who had written a treatise on human nature. He's, he actually ended up growing quite close to David Hume and kind of working with him pretty closely. But so he started being a professor in 1751. By 1759, Adam Smith wrote his first book. And it wasn't The Wealth of Nations, the one that he's probably most well known for. Instead, he wrote a book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments. As a text, I actually went to graduate school with a person that focused her entire career on this person, on that text, The Theory of Moral Sentiments. And long ago I gave it a quick read. So I'm going a little bit off of my memory of the text, but the basic idea of the theory of moral sentiments was that how is it that people who are just human beings in general, who are generally self-interested, why is it that they somehow restrict their self-interest at times to kind of pursue something more? Right? So we can think about this like a lot of ways, right? Like if I'm if I need more money, what is it that stops me from stealing money from a person, out of their pockets, or stealing their wallet, or stealing money from the bank itself? So for Smith, in Theory of Moral Sentiments, he perceived that limit isn't come from the fact that we're innately moral. There's no deep morality to a human being, but it's the fact that human beings are social and that they need approval of their peers, and that because approval comes from following certain customs and rules, that because of our pursuit of their others' acceptance, we do, in some sense, the right thing. The right thing being what others want us to do. So the idea is that the only reason why we act morally is because we are social creatures, and that morality, in some sense, is socially determined. If it became acceptable to steal money from others, then others would do it. That's our essence of Theory of Moral Sentiments. What is interesting about that book, though, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, is that another person read it, and his name was Charles Townshend. And Charles Townshend was quite powerful. He was the Chancellor of the Exchequer in England, which essentially is kind of like a Treasury Secretary. So he was the Treasury Secretary for England during in the time just before the Revolutionary War. And Charles Townshend, he's not remembered very much today. I mean, basically what he's remembered for today is that he really, in some sense, fueled the American Revolution, because he was the one that told the king that they should impose this heavy tax on the American colonists, and that they shouldn't have a right to elect their own judges. So because Charles Townshend said this to the king then did it, and the colonists in the United States got really grumpy and started a Revolutionary War. Now, why am I talking about Charles Townsend here? Because Charles Townsend read that book, Theory of Moral Sentiments, and he was really, really rich. And he said, dude, I want Adam Smith to be a private tutor for my kid. And he offered a lot of money. At the time, it was £500 a year, plus expenses, and a pension of £500 a year for life. I mean, dude, that's just crazy money for 1760s. It was so good that, even as a professor at the university, which already would have been paying pretty well, he was getting a little under £200 a year. So this was a more than doubling of his income. So, right, just to teach one kid, I mean, he did it. So he basically served as a tutor for one. And what people would do back in these days is that when they were really, really rich, they would hire a professor to be a private tutor. And basically you would do this kind of like grand tour of Western Europe. You would go to France, you'd go to Germany, you'd go to Italy, and you'd basically sit and talk to really smart people, go and visit really smart places, and you'd basically, you would be taught while at the same time experiencing the things. And so their first stop was France, as I said. But so they moved to the south of France, and they eventually ended up in Paris. And what the tutoring allowed Adam Smith to do is it allowed him some time and space to start writing more. And he not only was writing, but he would also start to talk to other scholars in France. And if you remember back to the previous lecture, the scholars in France at this time were the physiocrats, most importantly Quesnay. And Quesnay, if you remember from the previous lecture, was the one that had made that tableau économique, which was this idea kind of like the economy being like the human body, where there's circulation of blood that gives the body health, and in this case it's production that's flowing through an economy. And we talked about how that still exists today with the circular flow model. But the physiocrats, if you remember from the previous lecture, the physiocrats like Quesnay were focusing on the fact that only agricultural workers were true workers, that manufacturers were this kind of sterile class that weren't really focusing on what they should. And so you can kind of imagine here that, Adam Smith is sitting here in Paris, right? He's, sitting at a cafe, whatever, sipping his coffee or whatever those fancy Parisians drink, and he's talking to Quesnay. And remember, Adam Smith is coming out of England. So Adam Smith is coming out of this very manufacturing-heavy society of Scotland, of England. And he's obviously thinking, this idea of production flowing is a great idea, Quesnay, but I don't know why you're saying that manufacturing is so bad, right? And you have to think that Quesnay is kind of being, in France at the time, agriculture is the center of everything. So for Quesnay, he wasn't getting any resistance because everyone was like, agriculture does rule. But Smith was a critic of all this. And what it was for Quesnay that gave agriculture its value was the fact that it came from nature, right? So nature was kind of the provider of this value in an economy for Quesnay. For Smith, it was different. For Smith, it was just labor. So Adam Smith here adopts a labor theory of value. he starts to imagine that, again, you would have this flow of production in the economy, but it's a flow of basically things that embody the labor that it took for someone to grow something or to build something. Now, unfortunately, shortly after Smith started tutoring this kid, the kid's younger brother died. So basically, Smith lost his job. But I don't really know what the kid died of. Smith did try to get the kid taken care of by Quesnay, who, remember, was a physician, probably among the smartest at the time, but it didn't really matter. The kid died, Smith lost his job, and Smith would have to go find a new one. But with all that time, he started dictating now all of his kinds of thoughts and whatnot, and he did it quite intensely. And also talked to others at the time. Most notably, he actually talked a lot to Benjamin Franklin, who at the time, during the American Revolution, was our envoy to France. So he was working in France to kind of get the French troops to fight with us during the American Revolution. And that appears in The Wealth of Nations, because in The Wealth of Nations, the book comes out very positively towards the future of the United States. In 1776, though, about 10 years after that kid died, in 1776, he gets The Wealth of Nations published. And what he... the book itself is just, it's amazing. It's an amazing book. And it's not only just one book. It's actually, if my memory serves me right, it's 2 volumes, if I'm not mistaken. But what's interesting about the book is that what it does is it doesn't do anything really original. What it does is it actually just combines in one text all of the work of the others that were before him, which would be like John Locke, Sir James Stewart, Mandeville, Petty, Quintilian, Turgot, Quesnay, Hume, some of those names of which you've already heard now in the previous lectures. But he's basically just combining all of their thoughts together. I mean, it's just a incredibly detailed book, right? The famous example that he gives in it is this like really detailed discussion of what a pin factory looks like. But the book itself isn't a textbook. So while it does have a great deal of detail, you kind of have to hunt for the insights that come out of it. Now, the book itself is trying to it's not trying to promote one interest over the other. So unlike Quesnay, it's not trying to promote agriculturalists over manufacturers. It's not even promoting the interest of capitalists over workers, even though capitalists end up taking quite a good liking to this text. Rather, what it's doing, just as we would say for him when he's talking about moral philosophy or political economy, is that he's basically talking about why are things organized the way they are. In other words, he's talking about the laws of the market, and he's talking about the laws of society, where the laws of the market are understood as being made by some sort of invisible hand, where people that are pursuing their own self-interest are guided to the best solutions to offering things at a certain price. and that for the laws of society, again, the idea is that people have this liberty, this freedom to do things, but again, with some basic laws, the society is pushing things in a particular way. We could actually, let's see here. Let me pause this and get a video prepared for us here. 1 second. Okay, so we're not at this point yet, but Adam Smith was understanding, and I'm going to show this video here very shortly, but what Adam Smith, in terms of, again, the law of the market was trying to describe was how do we get order in our economy? I mean, think about it. You look around you right now, and when you're trying to buy things and whatnot, it's pretty rare that you see empty store shelves. It's pretty rare that you see completely off the whack prices from one store to the other, right? There's a kind of a similarity of prices across different manufacturers, across different stores. Even the wages that we earn at a certain job aren't too different from one employer to the other. So where does that organization come from, despite the fact that people are, again, self-interested? Meaning that they're acting in their own self-interest. Why aren't they just hurting people by charging really high prices for things and underpaying their workers? And the reason why is because of competition, at least for Adam Smith, is that the competition among different sellers and different buyers gets us organization in the system. Smith has this kind of famous quote, which I'll read, which is kind of what gives, that kind of combines organization in society with self-interest. He says, it's not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their self-interest. We address ourselves, not to their humanity, but to their self-love, and never talk to them of our necessities, but of their advantages. So basically, again, that it's self-interested why people do the things that they do. And again, that's also is aligned with how Adam Smith saw social harmony coming from the theory of moral sentiments, that people are self-interested, they want the approval of others, so they'll act in a way so that they get that approval from others. So it's not because they want to be moral for moral's sake, rather they want to be moral because it's in their self-interest to be moral. Okay, I just want to play this video. I'm hoping you can hear it. There's supposed to be a special way I'm supposed to set this up so you can hear things, but I'm hoping that my speaker will be loud enough that you'll hear it in the microphone.
If you have lots of readings to do, not just for your essays.
Okay, so we'll have to watch this ad.
You can just copy and paste.
This is a scene from Beautiful Mind, which is about John Nash, an economist in the 1950s, but his dissertation was working on theories of Adam Smith. I'm not going to watch all 4 minutes. These are the fellow graduate students of Adam Smith, and there is John Nash. Let's see here.
Have you remembered?
Here, so in this scene, yes, it's a little bit crass here, but all these young men are drinking at a bar, and they see someone beautiful walk into the bar, and they're kind of debating amongst themselves who is going to try to talk to this woman that's coming to the bar.
Recall the lessons of Adam Smith, the father of modern economics.
In competition, individual ambition serves the common good. Exactly.
Okay, so there we go. Individual ambition drives the human good.
For himself, gentlemen.
And those who strike out are stuck with their friends.
And I'm not going to strike out.
You can lead a blonde to water, but you can't make a drink.
I don't think he said
All
that.
right, let me move. She's looking over there. Right, she's looking at Nash.
All right, he may have the upper hand now, but wait until he opens his mouth.
History books.
Adam Smith needs revision.
What are you talking about?
If we all go for the blonde, we block each other. Not a single one of us is going to get her. So then we go for her friends. But they will all give us the cold shoulder because nobody likes to be second choice. But what if no one goes for the blonde? We don't get in each other's way. And we don't insult the other girls. And see we will win. That's the only way we all get laid. Adam Smith said, the best result comes from everyone in the group doing what's best for himself, right? That's what he said, that's right? Incomplete. Incomplete. Okay? Because the best result will come from everyone in the group doing what's best for himself. And the group.
But there we go. Right, rather than continuing to watch this, that does give you a pretty good idea, though, of the significance that Adam Smith had, on economics as a whole. John Nash, trained as a mathematician, actually ends up winning the Nobel Prize in economics, largely for this work on game theory, which is in some sense an extension of, again, the Adam Smith idea of how do you get order out of a society where everyone's acting in their own self-interest. Okay, so as we start to look at some of these slides here, now I've been talking about 30 minutes or so on just Adam Smith as a person, giving us an entry point into The Wealth of Nations. Again, I've said some of this already, but now at least you have it on the slide. Again, his father died shortly after birth. After his birth, he was really close to his mother, who lived actually a really long time. She lived to about 90 years old. Adam Smith never married, so he just always lived with his mommy. He went to, again, he's Scottish, so he went to Glasgow University. Again, he took a liking to reading the work of David Hume. And again, just decided to be a professor. Again, pretty well known, and probably most well known for Wealth of Nations, which is obviously the shorthand of the inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. Where the text essentially, if you were to ask me what does the book essentially say, it's exploring this just general question of why is England rich and why is Portugal at the time, why was it poor? That would essentially be the nature of the text. But again, he couldn't have written that book, Wealth of Nations, unless he had had the money that he got and the notoriety that he had gotten from writing the Theory of Moral Sentiments. Again, that's our the Duke of Buccleuch. Again, was the stepson of Charles Townshend, who had read the Theory of Moral Sentiments. And again, I've said much of this already. You're just getting at least it on a slide now. But Smith, while he was in Paris, again, he got this chance to meet Hume, who he'd always kind of admired. He got to work with Quesnay, and he got to work with the physiocrats, which again, all is where he's jumping off from. From having written Theory of Moral Sentiments, he's using that as a jumping off point to then write the Wealth of Nations. I've already said these things as well. Now, when we think about, again, a little bit more about what this text does for us, is what's interesting is that Adam Smith in the book, when he writes it in 1776, this is just when the Industrial Revolution is starting in England. And despite that, Adam Smith didn't actually predict the Industrial Revolution itself. In fact, I mean, the general sentiment of Adam Smith is that he saw, again, he understood value as coming from labor, from workers producing things, and that you could extract more labor by encouraging people to specialize and to engage in a division of labor. And basically, Adam Smith said, yes, countries are going to grow really fast for the next, let's say, 100 years or so, because they're going to do this division of labor. They're going to specialize. People are going to do very small tasks. We're going to get a lot of production out of them, but eventually it's going to decline. That was his theory. And then something else would come back. Something else would emerge. But the book became incredibly popular among those who did have a lot of wealth to justify why they were setting up large factories and why they were using labor, why they were using workers the way that they were. The other thing that Adam Smith is reacting to, right? So he's reacting to, again, the physiocrats in the one sense, because he wants to say that value is coming from both manufacturing as well as agriculture. But what he's also saying is that you need to get rid of mercantilist policies, which obviously, again, I talked about in the earlier lecture. We need to get rid of these mercantilist policies, which tend to restrict the way that things are produced. They tend to push things. They tend to push things in a sense of prioritizing internal production, when sometimes you'd get more production by sending it off externally. So, I mean, yeah, what is Adam Smith? Adam Smith thinks that order in society comes from having a free market. Right? So we get these premises. And the first premise comes from the fact that everyone is, again, self-interested. And they know what they need to do to promote those interests, right? So first, everyone's doing what's in their own self-interest. Following that, then everyone knows what to do with their own time and labor. So what the market does is it just guides people who are self-interested into doing things that work for the social good. Which is why in that video I just had showed you, why John Nash didn't say Adam Smith is wrong. What did he say? He said that what Adam Smith said was incomplete and that Adam Smith needed a revision. Because what we end up practicing today is that people do what's in their own self-interest, given that they know that others are doing the same. So we add that extra line in there to reflect the fact of like that bar scene where everyone was pursuing that one person and they were blocking each other. So sometimes we act in a way where we are anticipating the consequence that might come if we act in a certain way. That's really, in essence, how game theory is operating here. Okay, so again, we get this quote again, the quote that I read. Again, the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, the baker. It's people doing things in their own self-interest that gives us a market, that gives us the things that we need. So in Book 1, Chapter 1, the very first thing that he's coming out with is this division of labor. And you need this so that you get more productivity. Why do you need more productivity? Because it makes the economy stronger and grow bigger, right? Harkening back to the Kisne idea of a circular flow model of, right, you get more production, you get more productivity, you get more value flowing through the economy, more wealth. And he uses that again with, again, this incredibly famous, quite difficult to read pin example of a pin factory. I mean, read that thing. It's just, he basically was like touring factories and figuring out how people were actually producing things. I mean, it's kind of cool for us in the modern day to read these things, to understand how things like a pin was being manufactured. But again, what he's pointing out here, I mean, what he's seeing when he goes to that factory is the fact that you've got workers who are focused on just incredibly small tasks and then just become really, really good at it, right? In this case, someone's really, really good at grinding a pin. Someone else is good at straightening a pin. Someone else is good at cutting a pin, drawing it out, whatever. And so they divided this making of a pin into 18 different steps. But by dividing it up into 18 steps, 10 people were making 48,000 pins a day. That's quite a bit, right? Rather than having someone just do it all themselves. And so why is division of labor so important? Division of labor becomes so important because, just as all of us would know, just in our daily lives, right? When we focus on just doing a few set things, we become really, really good at doing those few set things, right? It's why, for instance, at least in my department, I focus on just a few different classes that I teach, and I really only teach those classes. It's not because I'm obstinate and don't want to teach something else. It's just that I've gotten good at it by doing it for the past 20 years, right? So there's almost never a semester where I don't teach principles of macroeconomics. It just always happens, right? And I've become really good at it. Sometimes I have to teach principles of micro, which I would do. But there's a few of my colleagues who only, at least out of experience in my life, there's sometimes a colleague who's never taught a 100 level course, right? They've only taught upper level undergraduates or graduate students. And they turn out to be horrible people in the 100 level classroom. Not because they're not trying well enough, but really it's just because, they're used to doing something else in a different way. We get more things produced by focusing on the things that we're good at. And this idea of dividing labor into very small tasks, getting a lot of production, well, then what we need is we need the market to exist to give a flow to everything. The market gives rise to this division of labor, and the market gives value to labor itself. And we can make this comparison to Plato, right, where he's just kind of stealing from Plato to some extent, where because people want to trade them for the things that they don't have, that they didn't produce because they're focusing on just making pins, for instance, but they need other things to live, well, then you need a market so that they can do this exchange to get the other things that they need. Smith doesn't talk a lot about, differences in people itself, differences in natural talents. So, for instance, could someone be a professor who's incredibly shy and introverted? They can. They tend to get lower teaching evaluations, and they generally dislike teaching, so they don't generally get into that profession. But it does highlight the fact that, different natural abilities sometimes make you better at doing a certain kind of job. Smith, for some reason, doesn't really focus on that. Now, if we were to write that kind of text today, we probably would say at least a few things about that. Again, for Smith, the value in things comes from work, comes from this division of labor. And you need the markets to exist so that people can trade, so that they can engage in this exchange. So what we would then need is we would need some rules of the market, or as Smith would put it, what are the rules of exchange, by which people naturally observe in exchanging commodities either for money or for one another. So basically, where is exchange, where is trade going to happen? Smith does this by understanding value in two different ways. First, he understands things as having a use value, and then second, he understands things as having an exchange value. So the use value would just come from the fact that when something is produced, it has a value because it is useful, right? So when I drink lemonade, it cools me off, it's nice and tart, and it refreshes me, right? But that use value from lemonade might be different from its exchange value, how much I actually paid for it, the money value of the good. We see this for Smith, this distinction being drawn out in his very famous diamond water paradox, which, as the two terms imply, diamonds don't have a lot of use value, but they have a really high exchange value, meaning I can live without diamonds, right? But they are very expensive. They have a high exchange value. I can't live without water, though. Water has incredibly high use value, but water, for the most part, is pretty cheap. Has a low exchange value. So what Smith takes from this example is that the use value doesn't really determine the exchange value. So what that would then force us to decide, or to have a theory about, is what is it that's determining the exchange value. For Smith, the exchange value is coming from labor. That labor is the first price, or the real price of things produced. Think about diamonds, right? If it's, yes, they're scarce and whatnot, but also they're really difficult, right, to get. You have to go to South Africa, you have to go to a big cave, you have to dig them out, that kind of stuff. Water, dude, it falls from the sky, right? It's in the oceans. Well, you can't drink that one, right? But it's in lakes, it's in rivers. It's pretty easy to get. And it doesn't require a great deal of labor to get it. And so labor is driving part of that exchange value. And what is nice about labor is that there is some universality to it, meaning that an hour of work is an hour of work. Whether I am digging a mine to get diamonds out or trying to get water out of it. And so to talk about this labor and this determination of value, Smith uses another example. Again, so this text is just full of examples, but he uses an example called the beaver and deer example, where essentially what you could say is that there's labor embodied in the things being produced, and if it requires twice as much time and labor to kill a beaver than it does to kill a deer, then we would have a general notion that in terms of exchange, about one beaver should exchange for about 2 deer, meaning that things trade at approximately their labor value. Okay, let me pause for a second. So for Smith, then, this labor in some sense is embodied or contained within the things produced. That's going to become important once we get to chapter 12. with Karl Marx. But essentially what we're seeing here is that we get what's called a labor command theory of the price, which is this idea that that once you put your labor into an object, how much would it allow you to purchase or command you to be able to purchase if you were to just exchange one good for the other. We don't typically do that kind of bartering, though, so we tend to kind of embody our labor into dollars, or not just dollars, but just some form of money. Now, what this gives us is that in kind of an earlier state of an economy or even just of a market, the labor that's embodied in something equals the labor command, right? So the labor within the object is also the amount of labor you can extract from it to get something else. And this comes because the worker owns all of the labor, right? They're making the thing at home. They're everything in them is in that product that was produced. But what happens is that as an economy gets older over time and capital is accumulated, then we start getting larger scales of production. We get factories and whatnot. And what happens is that no longer is the labor embodied equal to the labor command. And this happens because this inequality happens because now the worker has to share some of their output with the owner of the company. Now, obviously, this is actually what's going to be taken up again by Karl Marx, who says that this inequality is where the exploitation is coming from. But I mean, you and I all see this too, right? I mean, I see it, dude. I mean, I get paid. I mean, I'm a professor, right? So I'm not even like a low-paid person in the, faculty totem pole. But the idea is, right? You're all paying a far higher tuition amount than what I'm getting paid, right? So I certainly know I'm putting in a lot of labor into the class, and I'm certainly not getting it all paid out to me based on what you guys are all paying. Right, and so you get these kinds of quotes here from Wealth of Nations where essentially, again, capital accumulation becomes important for Adam Smith because it's how the economy progresses. And it's as the economy progresses, though, that we get this inequality between embodied labor and command labor. Okay, so I kind of put into some slides here kind of a simple example where, let's say I was doing things myself and I could make 100 bushels of corn with 300 hours of labor. And if we were to talk about what is my wage rate, though, under an accumulation phase, then it's just 0.25 bushels per hour. And what happens with that output, though, is that it's got to be shared between workers and the owners of the capital, right, or the stockholders. And so you get these two stages of, again, social formation, an early and rude state of the economy, and then a pure capitalist. And even if the corn output is the same, so that's column 2, and even if the labor input is the same, 300 hours, notice what happens to the wage rate. The wage rate goes down. And the reason why the wage rate goes down is because the total pool I have for payroll, in essence, is declining. Why is the total pool for payroll declining? Because now I have to have some guaranteed profits, something that goes to the owners of capital. And now again, what we can see is that because there's that sharing of the output between the owners of capital and the actual workers, that now there's a difference between the labor embodied and the labor command, where the labor command is understood as the labor embodied divided by the wage rate. And so what this then means in terms of the price of things is that we then have to basically add up the labor that's in something, which would be understood as the wages. And if we're trying to find this natural price to things, we would need to add the wages to the profits and then to the rents. The profits being those who own capital, rents going to those who own certain natural resources. Now, as a consequence to this, once we start adding things up, right, wages, profits, rents, what happens is that Adam Smith then no longer has a single consistent labor theory of value, unlike Karl Marx. And we'll see this, as well as Ricardo, we'll see this a little bit later here. But this would be another point of difference of opinion between Adam Smith and Karl Marx, where Karl Marx sees himself as building upon the work of Adam Smith. Now, one of these questions here then is, how do you divide things up? What's our theory of distributions? We have a theory of value, and we all in Adam Smith, but we also have to have a theory of distribution. And it's not entirely clear. Mark Blogg, who's a pretty well-known scholar of Adam Smith, basically said that in about 6 pages, half a dozen pages, there's about 5 different wage theories that exist: the subsistency, productivity, bargaining, wages fund. There's just a bunch of different theories of how this distribution is happening. But again, what Smith does say, which again does give some inspiration to Karl Marx later, is that Smith essentially says that labor is at a disadvantage for bargaining for higher wages, simply because employers, there's many employers, they stop workers from unionizing, working with each other, and they typically can't last very long once they do go on strike. So essentially, Smith is talking about an era when it was difficult for workers to unionize. And this also does explain why manufacturers, for the most, or just any company for the most part, doesn't want workers to unionize, because it gives them an upper hand in the distribution of value. I mean, as an aside, and this is not part of the class, this is just you, even just trying to understand me as a worker. I mean, I'm in a union, some of these theories of both Adam Smith, Karl Marx, and others would be part of the reason of what would be the economic reasoning for being in a union, is that you would be able to bargain for a higher wage for these 3 reasons, because you would be able to then combine, organize, and strike if you don't get what you want. Now, that said, right, it's a general lack of unions in the United States that has allowed the country to grow faster than some other countries where unionization is more prevalent. So, it's debatable, right? I mean, I'm saying as a worker, what works out best for me as a worker, but that's not always that's certainly not the case if I were an employer. Okay. In terms of the profits, he does indicate, Adam Smith does indicate that profits are legitimate. He doesn't really say how they're determined, but in some sense, the way we properly understand it today is that it's the reward for saving capital and taking the risks that come from saving for capital. And then for rents, which again we tend to understand as coming from owning certain resources. There's several theories he has for why rents should exist. We can take it as differential advantages, as we, as one sort of theory, which then Ricardo takes up. And there's also sometimes where Smith kind of suggests that those who are getting money just because they're extracting resources, in some sense, are kind of lazy. They love to reap where they've never sowed. But again, as I kind of mentioned earlier, for Adam Smith, what becomes, he doesn't see this economy that he's describing where division of labor exists and where it leads to capital accumulation as generating or giving us an economy that will eternally grow. It won't. Eventually, the gains that come from the division of labor will give us some additional productivity, which will eventually decline. And as that productivity declines, then we see less capital accumulation. And less capital accumulation gets us even less division of labor. What you tend to have to see here that has to happen is that you need the capital accumulation that comes from something. You need the accumulation of capital, which comes from that profit that exists from the division of labor. So capital begets more capital. You can't, and we practice this policy to this day. What's the problem in developing countries? Why are they so poor? Well, the answer is because they have a structure that doesn't allow for the accumulation of capital. And the accumulation of capital gives us more division of labor. More division of labor gives us more capital. And so you need then a structure that encourages savings, protection of property, to get us even more division of labor. On the other hand, what we see here is that there's a, when we ask ourselves, what is the wealth of a nation? The wealth of a nation comes from having productive workers that are producing things. So, for instance, manufacturers, merchants, and whatnot. These are the productive workers. We do have unproductive workers. Those are people that are employed in the service industry, which, interestingly, is our biggest industry, at least in the United States. We are a service-driven economy. So Adam Smith might not look too happily upon today's society if we were to do a Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure where he goes back in time. But again, as I already said, what we would see with Adam Smith is this eventual decline in the rate of profit. And as that profit declines, we would also see that slowing of capital accumulation. And that slowing capital accumulation would come as a result of even more competition, which then reduces a capitalist's profit that they get. The only way you can keep this going a little bit longer is if you extend the size of your market. So for Smith, he loved the idea of the United States being created because that was opening up an entirely new market that England could trade with, France could trade with, the Netherlands could trade with. And as you expand the market out, you extend the amount of time that you can get division of gains of having division of labor. We get eventually with Adam Smith this kind of stationary state. And in that stationary state, what we're seeing is that the country, it's not necessarily going backwards, but what's happening is that the profits are very low. And so we're not seeing a great deal of additional capital accumulation, which means that we don't get to see an additional amount of division of labor. To make all of this work for Adam Smith, we also need to have the government, we need to have a particular form of government. And that form of government is one of laissez-faire, which is a French term for hands-off, which we still do talk about today. If you were to take principles of economics, you'd still, the professor will still mention laissez-faire. And what you see there is that the government that is best is the government that is least. Meaning, the government at least according to M. Smith, that the government tends to be irresponsible, tends to be unproductive, and that as it does these things and passes laws which unnecessarily restricts production, that all that does is it hurts capitalism, it hurts the market. And so you would need to have a government that provides certain things, like public goods, and certain things that people wouldn't otherwise provide on their own. But really the role of government should be pretty simple beyond that. So for Adam Smith, he basically says that there are three things that the government should do. That it should protect, has a role in national defense, which in our case here would be something where, protects us from violence and invasion. The second role would be that there's a justice system that all citizens are subject to, so we have a consistent application of rules and laws. And third, again, that we create and maintain these kinds of public goods like roads, education, and whatnot, where there's these incredibly large positive externalities and no other individuals would otherwise personally provide them. But as in contrast to what the monetarists are pushing for, the government should not be imposing tariffs, should not be restricting imports or celebrating exports. They shouldn't be protecting certain industries from competition, and that basically the government should be small and not engage in unproductive spending. I mean, that's a pretty big set of things here. Now, Heilbronner, in a pretty noted text called The Worldly Philosophers, which, in principles I try to show that to students, what he had argued was that for Smith, the biggest enemy in any economy was having a monopoly, and that these monopolies were morally reprehensible, but in some sense they happen because people are self-interested, right? So companies get bigger and bigger, they get rid of their competitors, and then they do things to be able to keep their power over time. I mean, we see this especially in the early 20th century under Theodore Roosevelt, right, where he tries to break up certain trusts and monopolies. It even gives us the game Monopoly, which, right, you can see that the railroads, right, owning the railroads, you can get, if you own all four, you get $200, and you've got 4 chances people could land on things, right? Or if you own all the properties, you can build a hotel and can really charge high things, right? So for Adam Smith, he wants a strong market. The competitive market is what's needed to get social order in the entire society. And that, unlike, again, the mercantilist, he wants strong free trade. And what it allows you to do, and you would do this in a principles class, certainly you do it if you took principles with me, but you look at essentially what an entire country might be good at producing. And from there, you allow countries to specialize in what they're good at, meaning their comparative advantage. And then they trade for the other things they need according to some terms of trade. It doesn't matter that they have the absolute advantage, that they're the biggest country. Rather, countries trade based on where they have their comparative advantage. As I kind of come up with some kind of concluding thoughts here about Adam Smith, probably the biggest thing we could say in terms of Adam Smith having a moral philosophy is that Adam Smith represents this strong belief in the 1700s that people are both rational and, at least for Smith, that they're also selfish. And that rationality and selfishness, the consistency of those two things, gives us order. It makes society not seem that chaotic. Right? So all we have to do is do what's in our self-interest and act rationally, and there'll be order in the larger society. At least for Smith. Okay, I'm just making sure, just based on my notes, do I have anything else that I wanted to say? No, that's it.